In 1938, the Allied nations held a 2.7 to 1 advantage in population, and their combined GDP doubled the Axis powers. Drilling down into raw materials, the gap widens. The Allies controlled over 1 billion tons of crude oil, roughly 15 times the oil available to Germany, Italy, and Japan. By every standard economic metric, the Axis nations lacked the industrial capacity and resource base required to sustain a protracted global conflict. Initiating a war against vastly superior industrial foes defied basic accounting. But battles are not fought on ledger sheets. Knowing they couldn't win a long war of attrition, the Axis powers operated against a ticking clock, adopting a high-risk strategy of aggressive, rapid expansion. And for a while, it worked. By early 1942, despite facing a massive economic deficit, the Axis powers were decisively winning the war, expanding their borders with terrifying speed across Europe and the Pacific. Germany and Japan achieved this by mobilizing their economies well before the shooting started. They focused on high-quality engineering and swift tactical movements to overwhelm opponents who hadn't yet prepared for combat. This strategy required them to secure quick, decisive victories. The goal was to plunder conquered territories for food, metal, and fuel, feeding their own war machines before their domestic shortages caught up with them. When those quick victories failed to materialize by late 1941, the conflict shifted from a war of rapid movement into a grinding war of attrition. Suddenly, economic mass was the only thing that mattered. The Axis strategy relied on autarky, the idea of achieving complete economic self-sufficiency through military conquest. As the war extended, this system began to collapse under the weight of resource starvation. Domestically, Germany struggled to adapt. The regime stubbornly tried to maintain civilian living standards, delaying a shift to a true total war footing until Joseph Goebbels finally declared it in 1943. Operationally, they were suffocating from a lack of petroleum. This shortage left the German military dangerously reliant on vulnerable Romanian imports and highly exposed synthetic fuel plants. Japan faced an identical crisis. Entirely dependent on foreign imports before the war, their island economy was eventually paralyzed as Allied naval blockades systematically cut off their supply lines. Production on both fronts was further hobbled by bureaucratic corruption and a stubborn reliance on slow, craft-based manufacturing methods rather than adopting standardized mass production. The Axis powers built a highly capable, precision-engineered military machine. They just failed to secure the fuel, integration, and supply chains required to keep it running for a marathon. Recognizing that they were now fighting a war of attrition, the Allies responded by radically re-engineering their entire societies to activate their latent industrial capacity. The Soviet Union executed an extreme survival tactic. As the German army advanced, the Soviets physically dismantled 2,500 factories and relocated 17 million people eastward, safely out of reach. This massive logistical feat allowed the Soviet command economy to outproduce Germany in tanks and artillery, even after losing a huge portion of their territory and GDP to the invasion. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom maximized its highly centralized economy, committing a staggering 55% of its entire national GDP strictly to the war effort. By weaponizing their vast geography and sacrificing civilian comfort for absolute industrial output, the Allied nations successfully weathered the initial Axis onslaught. Then the United States entered the conflict. With its massive, idle economy finally mobilized, President Roosevelt's administration transformed the nation into the arsenal of democracy. Between 1940 and 1945, the national unemployment rate dropped from over 14% down to just 1.9%. This pivot to defense manufacturing effectively absorbed the remaining fallout of the Great Depression through industrial mobilization. With 20% of the population joining the military, the workforce underwent a massive demographic shift. 8 million women and millions of minority workers filled the factory voids to assemble defense materials. Through standardized mass production, American output scaled exponentially. By 1944, the U.S. alone was producing more military equipment than all the Axis nations combined. This chart visualizes the final production ledger of the war. The Allies built 637,000 aircraft, compared to 300,000 for the Axis. In armored vehicles, it was 4.3 million against 670,000. Victory was no longer a question of tactical brilliance. It was a mathematical certainty. The Allies achieved an avalanche of production that physically smothered the Axis war machine. Free societies, utilizing global integration, shared technology, and mass workforce mobilization, successfully crushed isolated, autarkic economies. The United States emerged from the conflict with a newly restructured workforce and an intact industrial base, cementing its status as a global economic superpower. Ironically, the total destruction of their craft-based industries forced Germany and Japan to rebuild from scratch. They adopted mass production and flexible manufacturing techniques, inadvertently driving their own massive post-war economic booms. World War II demonstrated a new reality of modern conflict. Tactical brilliance could win a campaign, but the victor of a global war was ultimately decided by the grinding efficiency